Most people believe that achieving abundance depends on luck, effort, or external strategies. But this is the greatest misconception of our era. True prosperity is not conquered, it reveals itself, and only awakens in those who have the courage to look within. Living in search of ready-made formulas, miracle mentors, or quick paths is like trying to fill a void with wind. Abundance is the consequence of an intimate encounter with one's own being. It flourishes in those who face their shadows, embrace silence, and learn to transform pain into consciousness. The danger is that many prefer to flee, living in a cycle of distractions that keeps them disconnected from their own essence. In this video, one of the greatest deceptions of modern spirituality will be undone: the belief that the divine is distant. You will understand that abundance does not manifest in temples or techniques, but in the instant when heart and mind enter into harmony. And, in the end, you may realize that what you've always sought outside has been asking to be awakened within all along. Abundance is not a prize awarded to those who fight hardest, nor a gift reserved for those who seem lucky. It is, above all, a reflection of an internal movement, silent, subtle, and often invisible to the hurried eyes of the world. When human beings turn their gaze inward, they discover that the prosperity they seek so much outside is not something to be conquered, but something to be awakened. It is a natural state of harmony with the flow of life, which reveals itself as the heart aligns with its own purpose for existing. For a long time, humanity confused abundance with accumulation. It believed that the more one has, the more secure one is. But security born from fear is fragile, and everything sustained by fear requires constant vigilance to avoid collapse. True abundance is different. It requires no effort to be maintained, because it doesn't depend on external circumstances. It is born from the awareness that everything needed is already available, and that the universe is not an adversary to be conquered, but an ally that responds to the internal vibration of each being. Itzhak Bentov said that consciousness is the most powerful instrument of creation. When a being vibrates in coherence with love, reality begins to reorganize itself spontaneously. Small synchronicities appear, doors open without warning, and what once seemed impossible begins to unfold before one's eyes. This is the point where the inner journey and external reality meet. When the individual transforms, the world responds to their new frequency. However, to reach this state, one must traverse the internal noise, the fears, beliefs, and limitations that form the labyrinth of the mind. Abundance does not flourish in hardened soil. The heart must be softened, what is felt must be accepted, and one must understand that each pain brings a teaching. The inward path is demanding because it forces the being to shed the masks created for survival. But, at the same time, it is the most liberating path that exists, for it reveals the silent strength that has always been there, awaiting recognition. There is a point in this journey when the seeker realizes that nothing needs to be conquered, because nothing was ever lost. Abundance, then, ceases to be a goal and becomes a state of consciousness, a way of being in the world. The person begins to act from fullness, not from lack. They begin to give not because there is surplus, but because they understand that giving is participating in the flow of creation. Life, in this state, ceases to be a competition and becomes a dance. And it is exactly in this movement of returning to the center that true prosperity is born, that which cannot be taken away by any circumstance. But not everyone can remain in this state for long. The mind, restless and conditioned, tends to seek control, results, and comparison once again. And it is at this point that the being risks falling into the opposite of abundance, a state of numbness and repetition, where the heart disconnects from presence and returns to autopilot, believing that life is merely survival. Many beings walk through life with open eyes, but with dormant consciousness. The body fulfills its functions, tasks are executed, words are spoken, but the spirit observes from a distance, as if living had become a repetitive theater. This mechanical mode of existence is what traps the individual in so-called autopilot, a state where movement replaces presence and constant doing occupies the place of feeling. Human beings believe they are evolving, but they repeat old patterns disguised as novelty. Emotions repeat themselves, worries return, days seem different only on the calendar. Inside, everything remains the same. Control, sustained by the fear of losing direction, consumes vital energy and weakens the connection with purpose. As Itzhak Bentov said, the mind, when it moves away from consciousness, becomes a gear that spins by impulse, not knowing where it's going. Autopilot is a state of deep distraction. The person convinces themselves they are progressing by seeking external solutions, courses, masters, techniques, but ignores the essential point. Real change is born from inner silence. The mind, taken over by noise, loses the ability to listen to the heart. And without this listening, abundance fades, for it flourishes only where there is clarity and surrender. Many spiritual seekers get lost in this labyrinth. They transform the path of self-knowledge into routine. They practice meditations, repeat mantras, follow formulas, but without presence. The initial intention, pure and vibrant, becomes mechanical habit. The ego, cunning, disguises itself as spirituality, keeping the being away from essence. The person believes they are enlightening themselves, but merely reinforces the same cycle of escape and denial. The most subtle thing is that this state of numbness goes unnoticed. Repetition becomes comfortable, and the absence of questioning gives the false impression of stability. The individual becomes accustomed to tiredness, to lack of enthusiasm, to the feeling that something is always missing. The brightness of life slowly fades, not from lack of opportunities, but from disconnection from the now. Even so, at some deep point, a call begins to echo. A discreet whisper, almost imperceptible, invites the being to interrupt the cycle and look within. This voice doesn't demand haste, only attention. Because, behind the noise and distraction, there is a silent force waiting to be recognized, and it leads the individual to the beginning of a true transformation. A process that will inevitably lead them to encounter their own shadows, where the power to awaken lies hidden. Every awakening process passes through an inevitable point, the encounter with internal shadows. The mind tries to avoid this confrontation, seeking distractions and justifications to postpone what needs to be looked at. But no path of expansion is sustained while the being continues fleeing from itself. The demons that seem threatening are not enemies, they are fragments of one's own consciousness asking for integration. The stored pains, unresolved traumas, and repeating beliefs form a kind of psychic labyrinth. Inside this labyrinth, the individual repeats behaviors, attracts similar situations, and always reacts the same way, as if trapped in an invisible script. This repetition is not punishment, it is opportunity. Each pattern that returns brings a message about what needs to be understood. Fleeing from these lessons is what prolongs suffering. Itzhak Bentov used to say that consciousness expands through the tension between the known and the unknown. The fear that arises before one's own shadows is the sign that the frontier of evolution has been reached. The being who has the courage to cross this frontier begins to perceive that internal demons are guardians of one's own light. They point to the parts of the soul that have not yet received acceptance, that still await being seen without judgment. The problem is that the modern world offers infinite ways to avoid this encounter. Social media, entertainment, excessive work, consumption, superficial spirituality, everything can become an escape. The individual distracts themselves enough not to have to feel. They live running, but without realizing from whom they are running. And the more they flee, the more the pain grows, seeking to be recognized. Consciousness does not allow anything to remain hidden for long. Sooner or later, what was repressed returns asking for healing. The confrontation with shadows requires neither violence nor self-punishment, but rather presence and courage. It is a delicate process that invites the being to observe what they feel without identifying with what they feel. fear, anger, guilt, and shame cease to be monsters and reveal themselves as parts of the soul that simply want to be welcomed. Deep silence becomes the ground where these emotions can finally rest. Facing one's own demons is an act of love. Love for oneself, for each rejected part, for each mistake that served as learning. The being who allows themselves this dive discovers a power that doesn't depend on anything external, the power to regenerate, to recreate oneself from truth. In this state, suffering loses its dominion, and the individual begins to recognize that everything that disturbed them was, in reality, a call from the soul to return to itself. Upon traversing this process, something inside quiet. A new clarity emerges, a feeling of lightness that doesn't come from ready-made answers, but from full acceptance of what is. This quietude opens the necessary space for the next step of the journey, the moment of pause and reconnection, where the being, after facing their own shadows, learns to rest in their own presence. After traversing the territory of shadows, the being begins to understand the importance of quietude. The internal struggle gives way to serene observation, and the noise that once seemed impossible to silence gradually loses strength. Consciousness turns to the simple, to the gesture of being present. At this point, the seeker realizes that reconnection doesn't depend on long retreats or withdrawal from the world, but on small moments of surrender in the midst of common life. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of one's own essence. It reveals itself in the instant when breath is observed, in the space between one thought and another, in the attentive gaze before something ordinary. These brief instants, when lived with awareness, begin to reorganize inner energy. The mind, accustomed to urgency, learns to slow down. The heart, once compressed by external demands, returns to expanding. Itzhak Bentov stated that human beings, by remaining in a state of presence, become conductors of harmony. Personal vibration adjusts to the natural rhythm of the universe, and energy flows with more balance. This inner synchrony creates a field that affects everything around: relationships, the body, the environment. The outer world begins to reflect the state of calm born in the being's interior. Simple practices are sufficient to nurture this state. Breathing consciously before sleep, observing sounds without interpreting them, feeling the contact of feet with the ground, gestures that seem small but carry transformative power. In these pauses, the body realigns with the mind, and the mind surrenders to the quietude of the spirit. Abundance begins to manifest as a natural feeling of completeness, not as a desire to be achieved. This reconnection doesn't mean rejecting the movement of life. It means participating in it with lucidity. Work, commitments, responsibilities continue, but the way of being present changes completely. The individual begins to act with awareness, instead of reacting by impulse. Each choice becomes more aligned, each gesture more meaningful. Time ceases to be an enemy to be defeated and becomes an ally that teaches rhythm, presence, and purpose. Within this state, the being discovers that abundance is not a grand event, but a continuous flow that renews itself with each breath. The heart learns to be grateful, not for what is missing, but for everything already being sustained by life. Silence becomes nourishment, and the simple act of being alive begins to carry a new dimension of meaning. This state of balance prepares the ground for an even deeper step: the encounter with self-compassion, acceptance of life's phases, and the wisdom of respecting one's own rhythm. It is in this next movement that the being learns to transform judgment into love and rigidity into lightness. After learning to pause and listen to their own silence, the being begins to see life in another light. Internal demands soften, and the perception of perfection gives way to acceptance of the process. The spiritual path is not linear. It oscillates between advances and withdrawals, between moments of clarity and periods of doubt. Understanding this is the first step to cultivating self-compassion, the state of embracing oneself with tenderness, even on days when the mind insists on pointing out flaws. Human beings have been conditioned to measure their own worth by productivity and result. This mental pattern makes them believe that resting is giving up, that making mistakes is failing, and that slowing down is wasting time. However, the soul doesn't work under the same principles of haste. It matures in the time of feeling, not in clock time. Itzhak Bentov said that the universe is not in a hurry, but it is never late either. Consciousness grows at the exact rhythm the heart can sustain the learning. Self-compassion arises the instant the individual recognizes they don't need to be perfect to be at peace. Accepting one's own fragilities doesn't weaken the spirit. On the contrary, it makes it more real, more human. This acceptance dissolves judgment and opens space for healing. The energy once spent trying to control life transforms into creative force. The being begins to understand that each phase, including the most challenging ones, is an expression of divine wisdom acting in human experience. During pregnancy, for example, many women report the challenge of dealing with vulnerability and the weight of expectations. It is common for the mind to demand productivity and performance, even in the face of such a sacred process. This internal conflict is a mirror of what happens in many areas of life. By recognizing one's own limits and respecting the natural rhythm of body and soul, inner energy changes completely. Judgment dissolves and self-love flourishes organically, without effort. Being compassionate with oneself is allowing each phase to have the necessary space to fulfill its function. Moments of retraction are as valuable as those of expansion, for both are part of the same cycle of growth. Just as the heart alternates contraction and relaxation to keep life pulsing, spiritual evolution also moves in cycles. Wisdom lies in not resisting any of them. Self-compassion transforms one's gaze. Pains cease to be seen as failures and begin to be recognized as portals of learning. The being matures emotionally, not from having won battles, but from having learned to walk with lightness even in the face of them. This lightness opens a silent space, a serene clarity that prepares consciousness for the next step of the journey, understanding the true source of abundance, the connection with the divine, where mind and spirit find balance. The path of abundance culminates at a point where the being perceives that nothing is separate. Everything that has been lived, the pains, the silences, the learnings, and the pauses, leads to this reunion with the divine, a force that is not outside, but pulses in the interior of each particle of life. The divine does not reveal itself in words or grandiose rituals, but in the silent harmony between heart and consciousness. The individual who aligns with this presence begins to walk with serenity, sustained by a trust that doesn't depend on circumstances. In this state of communion, fear loses the power to guide choices. The mind, once restless, bows before the wisdom of the spirit. Vital energy flows with balance, and life becomes an expression of gratitude. It's not about denying pain, but about transforming it into understanding. Each experience, however challenging it may seem, carries a sacred message, an invitation to expansion. The divine does not punish, it only teaches through the situations that touch the soul most deeply. Itzhak Bentov used to describe human beings as living antennas, capable of tuning into different frequencies of consciousness. By raising vibration through presence, gratitude, and love, the individual begins to attract more harmonious realities. Abundance, at this point, ceases to be a concept and becomes an experience. Everything falls into place naturally: people, opportunities, intuitions. The universe responds to the frequency of the awakened heart. Balance arises when reason and faith cease to compete for space and begin to cooperate. The mind, guided by discernment, unites with the spirit, which leads with wisdom. This union creates a state of peace that doesn't depend on material conquests, but on inner alignment. The being begins to understand that true prosperity is feeling in communion with the whole, a feeling of belonging that dissolves loneliness and awakens the joy of simply existing. The presence of the divine manifests in the most subtle forms, in someone's smile who crosses your path, in the wind that touches your face, in intuition that arises without warning. Each instant transforms into a sign. The mind that has learned to be silent can now hear the universe speaking through small things. In this state, life becomes constant prayer, and gratitude becomes the soul's natural language. Abundance, then, reveals its true meaning, a state of fullness born from the union between the human and the sacred. Nothing needs to be conquered, for everything is already being sustained by a loving intelligence that inhabits each being. This is the point where the seeker understands that the path was never about accumulating or achieving, but about remembering what has always been within. And, upon recognizing this truth, consciousness expands in silence, ready to share with the world the light that awakened within itself. This entire inner journey points to a single purpose: awakening consciousness to the power of creating one's own reality. Abundance does not manifest by chance, but through the frequency each person sustains daily. Looking within, embracing shadows, silencing the mind, and aligning with the divine are not practices distant from common life. They are choices that renew themselves at each instant. The invitation now is simple, but transformative. What have you been feeding within yourself? The fear that paralyzes or the presence that expands? How many times a day do you allow yourself to pause and feel your own breath, remembering that abundance is not what you have, but what you vibrate? Each thought is a seed, each emotion a gesture of creation, and life responds with precision to what you emanate. So, begin today to cultivate the internal ground you wish to see flourish. If this content touched you in some way, subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and continue learning to live consciously. There is still much to explore about the mysteries of the mind, spirit, and the energy that moves the universe.